I just check if we are live. Okay, we are live. Good evening, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon from wherever you are joining this. My name is Ishan Sharma. I'm the founder of Caravan Heritage. It's a student-led collective which is trying to make academic history more accessible in the times that we live in. These are interesting times, as the Chinese proverb goes, that may you born in interesting times. And these are indeed very interesting times where uh, there's a need to engage with the past more than ever before. And to do that, we have a very special guest this evening with us, Professor Robin Bernstein, joining us from Harvard University. And we will be having a conversation on her most recent book called Freeman's Challenge, The Murder That Shook America's Original Prison for Profit. I'll just read out a formal introduction before getting into the conversation with Professor Bernstein. She is a cultural historian who specializes in American United States racial formation from the 19th century to the present, a graduate of Yale's doctoral program in American Studies and an elected member of the American Antiquarian Society. He is the Dillon Professor of American History and Professor of African and African American Studies and Professor of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Harvard University. Currently, she is the chair of Harvard's doctoral program in American Studies. She is also a faculty member in the undergraduate program in theater, dance, and media. Her new book is Freeman's Challenge, uh, and her previous book, Racial Innocence, Performing American Childhood from Slavery to Civil Rights, won 5 awards. The Outstanding Book Award from the Association for Theatre and Higher Education, the Grace Abbott Best Book Award, the Book Award from Children's Literature Association, and many others. Uh, and we are very excited for presenting to host to this evening. Why don't we just get into the conversation and why don't we start by telling us who was William Freeman and uh, and why is this story so important for understanding the history of incarceration in America? Professor Bernstein, I think there is some audio issues. We just lost your voice. Can you check the audio settings, maybe? There is some audio issue. I can't hear you all right.
Okay. What should we do?
Can you just reconnect the audio device, the microphone?
You want me to disconnect and reconnect my microphone? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me try that. Okay.
It just lost.
First of all,
You have to unmute.
right. Can people hear me now?
Yes, now it's all right here.
Well, can the people who couldn't hear me before, can they hear me now?
Yes, they can.
Okay, great. All right, we did it. Excellent. So, should I start answering the question from the top, or should I just continue? You tell me what would be best.
Let's start from the beginning. Maybe I'll ask you the same question again for those
Okay. Who was
who
William Freeman?
who
So,
was
who was
William
William
Freeman
Freeman?
and the whole history of incarceration. What does his story tell us about the whole history of incarceration in America?
Yeah. Okay. So William Freeman was an African American and also Native American teenager who grew up in a small village called Auburn in New York State. So this is in central New York State, north of New York City. And Auburn was special because in Auburn at the beginning of the 1800s, a group of white businessmen came up with a diabolical idea, a new idea, which was that a prison could exist primarily to be an economic force. Prior to Auburn, prior to the innovation of these white businessmen, prisons in the United States basically existed for some combination of three reasons. Either they existed to punish people, and or they existed to control people, basically to get them off the streets, and or they existed to reform people, basically to help people live better lives. But this group of white businessmen in Auburn, New York, said, we don't care about any of that. They threw all of that out the window. And they came up with this new idea that a prison could exist mainly to bolster a local economy and, not coincidentally, to enrich local white businessmen, which is exactly what they were. So they created this prison that was designed to extract money from the state, and it also had factories built into the prison. And the prisoners were forced to work in these factories where they were manufacturing consumer goods that were then sold by private companies. And meanwhile, the prisoners did not receive a penny, no wages whatsoever. So William Freeman happened to be born right near the prison. That was just a coincidence. And he grew up as part of the most prominent Black family in town. His grandparents had actually been fundamental in establishing Auburn and in establishing the Black community of Auburn. So he grew up in this really prominent family, and he was well loved as a member of this prominent family. His life was in a lot of ways pretty hard. He had to work from an early age, but his life was in a lot of ways good as part of this community and part of this family. But everything changed for William Freeman when he was 15 years old. And this was 1840. In that year, he was accused of a horse theft. He swore that he did not steal the horse, and there was no hard evidence against him. But it didn't matter. He was tried, he was convicted, and he was sentenced to 5 years hard labor in the Auburn State Prison. Now, William Freeman had always been free. He had never been enslaved. His mother had always been free. His father had been enslaved and then had become free. His grandparents had been enslaved, and while they were building Auburn, they had been forced to do that as enslaved people. But William Freeman was part of this new generation in New York of free Black people. And when he was convicted of this crime that he swore he did not commit, and he was sentenced to the Auburn State Prison, what he was literally told was, you are now a slave of the state. You will now be forced to work for other people's profit for the time of your incarceration. And William Freeman was furious. And what makes him really important is that he challenged the system, hence the title of my book, Freeman's Challenge. William Freeman challenged the original profit-driven prison. He challenged the entire system of profit-driven incarceration, and he challenged it right at its source.
You mentioned about Auburn prison labor model as criminality disguised as justice in the book. Can you expand on this idea? Because you were just mentioning about how they were not paid wages and it was like slavery.
Yeah. Yeah, the prison system that was innovated at Auburn was basically a form of organized labor theft. The whole idea of it, the very reason the prison was established, the purpose was to take value from other sources, funnel it through the prison, basically launder the money, basically, funnel the money through the prison system and then put it in the hands of white businessmen. So they were taking money from the state. The state was giving the prison money for the purpose of maintaining the prison. But the reality was that the people who were running the prison, a lot of them from the very beginning, were crooks. They were stealing the money. They were doing things like they were embezzling, basically. They were corrupt. So they were taking this money from the state and they were using some of it to run the prison, but a lot of it they were just pocketing. Meanwhile, they were forcing prisoners to work. And that they were describing that as slavery, and slavery is itself a form of labor theft. Now, it was legal. It was legal in the United States at the time. Slavery was legal, and forced prison labor is still legal in the United States. But the fact that it's a legal form of theft does not mean that it's not a form of theft. Slavery is a form of labor theft. It also steals people's lives. It steals people's dignity. Whether it's legal or not is entirely beside the fact. So it was a form of organized labor theft, a form of sucking a life force out of incarcerated people, all for the purpose of enriching white businessmen.
In the book, you mention about how this system aimed to strip prisoners from individuality
I'm
and
sorry,
autonomy and
I'm
turn
having
them
trouble
into
hearing
slaves
you.
as
The sound
humans.
is, I'm sorry, the sound is going out.
Is it
Can you
better
repeat the
now?
question? Can, can you repeat?
Is it better now?
I think so, yes.
Um So as I was mentioning in the book, you mentioned about how the system kind of aimed to strip prisoners from individuality and autonomy and turn them into slaves of the state, as you just mentioned. I was wondering how do they the people at the prison justify the brutal treatment of prisoners? What was the theory of punishment that they kind of adopted in the prison?
I'm so sorry, I couldn't hear that question. I'm so sorry. Can you repeat it?
Uh, is it better now?
Yeah, maybe you could just say it again. I'm trying really hard to hear you.
I'm mentioning about the theory of punishment at the Auburn system because you mentioned how they were stripped of their individuality, the prisoners, and autonomy. So, what was the justification given by the by the prison employees for the brutal treatment of prisoners?
Ah, got it. Yes, yes, that I heard. Thank you. So, yes, the Auburn State Prison was a very violent place. And there's a reason for that. Remember, the whole purpose of the Auburn State Prison was economic. The purpose was to steal labor from the incarcerated people and to give them nothing in exchange. It's actually very difficult to force a human being to work for no benefit at all. They were getting no wages, they were getting no special privileges, they were getting no possibility of early release, they were getting really nothing. And it's very hard to force a human to work under those circumstances. Really, the only way you can force a person to work for nothing, for no benefit at all, is through a combination of extreme violence and extreme social control. And that's exactly what the Auburn State Prison did. So it was a very violent place. If there was any infraction at all, prisoners were beaten. They were waterboarded. Believe it or not, the Auburn State Prison actually invented a new form of waterboarding. They were whipped And all of this, the purpose of all of this was not punishment. The purpose was not to punish anybody for their crime. The purpose was productivity. The purpose was to get people to work as hard as they could, as fast as they could, as efficiently as they could. And it had nothing to do with justice. It had absolutely nothing to do with making the world a better place. It had nothing to do even with crime. It had everything to do with extracting labor from a workforce that was, for the most part, powerless to resist. And yet, William Freeman did resist, and William Freeman did challenge the system.
This murder spree, Freeman's murder spree that kind of happened, shook the white America at that time. Of course, you kind of talk about it in the book also, and those who are watching us right now, we highly recommend reading the book. It's an important chapter of America's history, of modern history especially. But before moving further and talking about the race and the this, and I want to know how did this murder spree and what was the response? How did the response of to his crimes shape the cultural landscape of that era or the legal landscape of that era?
Yeah. Yeah. So first, let me talk about how William Freeman resisted in the prison, how he challenged America's original prison for profit while he was incarcerated. From the moment Freeman was incarcerated, he resisted his exploitation. He told his jailers that he did not want to work, and that the reason he did not want to work was both because he had committed no crime, but also because he felt that he deserved to be paid for his labor. He was a free person, he was not a slave. And as you can imagine, that did not go over well. The retribution against him was truly awful. He was beaten horribly while he was in prison. The guards beat him viciously. And in the worst instance, he was beaten so badly, a guard beat him over the head with a board. And the guard beat him so terribly that he broke his skull and he had a brain injury. And also, as a result of this beating, William Freeman lost most of his hearing. He became largely deaf. And yet he kept challenging the system. He was a very brave person. And let's remember that this is a teenager. This is a young person. He was incarcerated when he was 15. He got out when he was 20. So he had an enormous sense of his own worth as a worker in the world, as a citizen. And he didn't hesitate to speak up and to articulate that even when the consequences were brutal. So he gets out of prison and he is now deaf. He is now brain injured and he's furious. And what he's most angry about is the fact that the state of New York has stolen 5 years of labor from him and failed to pay him for it. So William Freeman launched a legal campaign to try to recover back wages. That's how he saw it. He said the way he looked at it was that he had worked for 5 years and he deserved back wages. So he went to magistrates, lawyers basically, and he tried to get lawyers to represent him in a case against the state of New York. And he was laughed at and he was dismissed. So for 6 months after his release, he kept trying and trying to launch a legal case against the state of New York, and it did not work. And at a certain point, William Freeman transferred his goal from getting back pay to getting payback. And what William Freeman did was he committed a murder. And when I say that, I'm not giving away anything in the book. The murder is right there in the title of the book, Freeman's Challenge, the murder that shook America's original prison for profit. So when you read the book, and I hope you will read the book, you know from the beginning that there is a murder in the book, and you know from the beginning that the person who commits the murder is William Freeman. But the big question is why? Why did he commit this murder? And you would expect him to commit a murder of somebody who was responsible for him going to the prison, who was responsible for his conviction for a crime he swore he did not commit. Or perhaps you would expect him to kill the person who beat him so terribly and deafened him. But William Freeman didn't do any of these things. William Freeman actually killed several white people who had nothing to do with his incarceration. And this is really important. And this is what was so frightening. By killing people who were not directly responsible for his incarceration, what he basically did was commit an act of terrorism. I mean, this is how terrorism works. It works by injuring or killing random people, people who are not directly tied in some really obvious way to a system. And by committing an act of terrorism, what he did was terrorize New York. New York was terrified by this action that he committed. And what was so terrifying about it was not simply the fact that it was a murder, because let's face it, there are lots of murders. It wasn't simply the fact that people died. It wasn't even simply the fact that white people died. What was so terrifying about the act that William Freeman committed was that in this act, he named a really important fact, which was that everybody was implicated in what was happening in the prison. Everybody in New York, and certainly everybody in the Auburn area, was economically tied to the prison because the prison had become the economic center of Auburn. And in a lot of ways, it had become very economically important to all of New York State. So everybody, it didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter if you worked directly for the prison. It didn't matter if you were directly doing business with the prison. The prison was enriching the entire area. Everybody was economically entangled with it in one way or another. And when William Freeman killed some white people who were not directly connected to the prison, he named that fact. He identified everybody as being connected to this criminal organization. And that was really upsetting. Nobody wanted to hear that. Remember, the Auburn State Prison was making Auburn prosperous. The Auburn State Prison had enabled this tiny little village of Auburn to turn into a city. So everybody was economically dependent on it in one way or another. And William Freeman challenged the point of their dependence. So this was enormously terrifying to everybody in the area, especially to white people, and white people pushed back against William Freeman.
Uh, can we draw, you know, coming to contemporary, there are cases of, you know, if we can say oppression of the black even today in America by the whites. Do you see the emergence of the myth of black uh, criminality emerge from this case?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the results of this case, when William Freeman committed this crime, it went to trial, and there was no question that he had committed the crime. He admitted that he had. But the question was really, why had he committed it? Because remember, everybody was so upset and so frightened, and yet nobody wanted to hear what he was saying. He was very clear about why he committed this murder. He committed this murder because his labor had been stolen by the Auburn State Prison, and his true target was everyone, because everyone was a part of this system. So he was really clear about why he committed this crime, but nobody wanted to hear it. It was too frightening what he was saying. So everybody wanted a different explanation. They wanted to hear not the truth. They wanted to hear a story. They wanted a different story. So the case went to trial, And the trial got very big very fast, in part because William Freeman was defended pro bono for free by William Henry Seward, who at the time had recently been the two-time governor of New York State. So basically, a famous person steps up to defend William Freeman. Meanwhile, the prosecutor was also famous. The prosecutor was John Van Buren, who was the son of Martin Van Buren, who had recently been the United States president. So it was the son of a recent president versus a recent governor of New York State fighting about William Freeman. So this was big news. It was big news both because the crime itself was big news, but then the trial became big news. Now, William Henry Sumner and John Van Buren, they were both economically entangled with the prison because everybody was. And one thing I show in Freeman's Challenge is how both of these people had conflicts of interest. They were both entangled with the prison, and they both had an interest in shutting up William Freeman, silencing Freeman's challenge to the Auburn State Prison. And so that's what they did in different ways. One of them was arguing that Freeman was, William Henry Sumner, the defense, was arguing that Freeman was not guilty by reason of insanity, which is to say that his claim was irrational, which it most certainly was not. Meanwhile, John Van Buren was arguing that Freeman had committed this crime not because he had a legitimate critique of the prison, but rather because of some sort of innate biological racial violence. That John Van Buren was basically arguing that Blackness was inherently tied to criminality, and that's why Freeman committed this crime. Now today, that lie, that racist lie about innate criminality is very, very common. We've all heard of this, and it's very powerful in the United States and in other places as well. But at the time, this was a relatively new idea. This was 1846, and this was not a common idea in the United States at the time. So when John Van Buren promulgated this idea, he articulated it and promulgated it through this trial, which was then repeated nationally because it was reported on nationally. This became an inaugural moment in this racist lie, this racist libel of inherent Black criminality. This is one of the points of origin for that racist lie.
You mentioned about the trial, and there was a retrial also, and it became a national spectacle of sorts. Related to this, how did the court grapple with Freeman's mental state and his treatment in prison? Do you see any echoes of those debates in today's legal system in America?
I'm having a little trouble hearing you, but I think you just asked me how the courts dealt with Freeman's medical state. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So the his medical records became his medical not his medical records, but his medical history was very important to the trial because his defense lawyer argued that this happened because of his head injury, and also argued that it happened because of racism itself, which is a complicated argument. William Henry Sumner argued that Freeman committed this murder, again, not because of the prison, which is what William Freeman said, but because he had this head injury. So basically, this was a way to completely dismiss everything he was saying as merely irrational. The specific word they used was delusion, that William Freeman had a delusion that he had the right to be paid for his work, that this was an insane idea. And so his medical history became the explanation, which was a diversion that enabled people to not listen to Freeman's claim, his very rational critique of the Auburn State Prison. So basically, his medical history became yet another way to shut him up.
Uh, there you mentioned two names already, but there were two more names mentioned in the book. One is Frederick Douglass, and the other is Walt Whitman.
Yeah.
And Walt Whitman was he was an abolitionist. Uh, uh, so how did these early critics? He was also an early critic of prison labor. So how did these early critiques of prison labor shape later abolitionist movements in America, because they turned the other way?
Yeah. Yeah. So the case was reported on nationally. And so a lot of really famous people got involved. One of the people who got involved was, as you mentioned, the poet Walt Whitman, the American poet, who was, as you mentioned, an abolitionist, and he also was against the death penalty. So, Walt Whitman was also somebody who cared about prison reform. So he was not interested in critiquing prison for profit per se, but he was interested in critiquing the violence of the Auburn State Prison. So he had actually been writing about the Auburn State Prison for quite a while before Freeman hit the newspapers. He had been very aware of how violent the Auburn State Prison was and how difficult the lives of people incarcerated there were. So Walt Whitman had been involved for quite a while. And then when William Freeman committed these murders, Walt Whitman commented on it. And basically, Walt Whitman's perspective was very similar to that of William Henry Sumner. He was, excuse me, I said Sumner, Seward, William Henry Seward, excuse me. His point was very similar to that of William Henry Seward, which was that Freeman was simply irrational, that William Freeman was simply a lunatic. And as such, from Walt Whitman's perspective, Freeman deserved compassion. And Freeman deserved not to hang, but instead to be incarcerated in a mental hospital. So that was the perspective that Walt Whitman was writing from. Meanwhile, Frederick Douglass had a very different perspective. So Frederick Douglass was a Black abolitionist in the United States, a major force and a major intellectual of the 19th century. So he was living not very far from Auburn. He was living in Rochester, New York, and he was also traveling all over the world at the time and lecturing against slavery in the American South. Now, Frederick Douglass had been touring all over New York State for a long time. He had been lecturing in many, many parts of New York State, but he had never come to Auburn. And then immediately after Freeman's trial, all of a sudden, Frederick Douglass, along with a lot of other Black abolitionists, became very interested in coming to Auburn and telling their own stories. So when Frederick Douglass came to Auburn immediately after William Freeman's trial, Douglass did not speak about Freeman. Instead, what Douglass spoke about was Douglass. Douglass spoke about himself, and he spoke about freedom, and he spoke about slavery. And in a way, what Douglass was doing was reversing the effects of part of the effects of the trial. The effect of the trial, the main effect of the trial was, first of all, to criminalize Black people, and second of all, to shut up William Freeman, to shut up his critique of the Auburn State Prison. A Black man, a Black young man, had been silenced in this trial. And what Frederick Douglass did was come to Auburn as a Black man and speak and share his own perspective and his own political critiques, his own perspective on freedom, his own story. So this is, in a way, a counterbalance. And what's really important is that Frederick Douglass wasn't alone. There were many other Black abolitionists who, prior to Freeman's trial, had never come to Auburn, had never lectured in Auburn. And then all of a sudden, right after the trial, they start converging on Auburn. Auburn becomes an important place for Black self-narration. And then it became an important place for Black publishing. So Frederick Douglass published the first edition of his second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom. He could have published it anywhere. He published it in Auburn as well as other places. So it became a center for Black publishing. Harriet Tubman came and settled in Auburn, again, after William Freeman's trial. She settled there, and when it became time for her to publish her self-narration, that was published in Auburn. So basically, after Freeman's trial, Auburn became a site of Black self-narration, Black self-determination, and Black freedom making.
And we are not going into the later part of the book, which I think people should read on their own and understand. There's a twist in the end that people might find interesting and might see parallels in the present time. This is, the narrative of the book is so interesting that one can just read through the book in one sitting. But I would like to now ask the last segment of the interview, which is on historian's crowd, because writing this kind of history is very difficult. You work through a erroneous volume of historical records, which are the court documents or the newspaper or the letters. But what were some of the challenges that you kind of faced in the archive? One could be the bias of the documents, especially the court documents. So how do you present the story of Freeman through those documents?
Yeah, it was a very difficult story to tell. So there were all kinds of difficulties. One difficulty is that William Freeman never wrote his own story. He also never dictated it. So somebody like Harriet Tubman, for example, the abolitionist, she could not write, but she dictated her own story and she spoke with reporters. So we have her original words. William Freeman was interrogated by all kinds of people, but he never dictated his own story on his own terms, and he never wrote his own story. So I was really reliant on what other people said Freeman said, and that creates all kinds of difficulties. But one of the ways that I managed that difficulty was I listened across sources. So of the people who said what he said, some of them were very hostile to him. Some were white people who wanted to shut him up. But some of the people who said what he said were his family members, people who loved him very much. And so what I was always listening for was we have these diverse people, racially diverse people, people who are very diverse in their perspective on Freeman. Whenever I heard them agree, that to me was something that I took very seriously as truth. I figured if people who hated William Freeman and people who loved William Freeman both said William Freeman said X, it was probably true. And so that was one of the ways that I managed these very difficult archives. Another difficulty in the case was that I was working extensively with the bureaucratic records of the Auburn State Prison. Prisons are bureaucracies. And as bureaucracies, they produce a lot of data, they produce a lot of reports. And one thing I realized as I was doing the research for Freeman's Challenge was that the reports were written by criminals. These prison reports were written by corrupt, evil liars who were writing these reports for the purpose of obscuring the truth. They were writing these reports for the purpose of covering up their own crimes. Now that's a difficult text to read and analyze. So I had to really learn how to read between the lines, read for what wasn't said in these reports, read for what was said and what was verified and what I could actually corroborate was true, but also read with enormous suspicion. So that was pretty difficult. It took me a long time to learn how to do that. But it was very fruitful ultimately.
And did you also visit the Auburn prison and did you get the chance of interacting with the prison inmates
I
of the
did.
prison?
I did. So the Auburn prison still exists. Today, it is called the Auburn Correctional Facility. It is today the oldest continually operating maximum security prison in the United States. It is still driven by profits. So the factories that William Freeman was forced to labor in, the Auburn prison still functions through factories. There are still factories built into the prison to this day. And the prisoners in the Auburn prison today, they're manufacturing furniture, which is something that was manufactured in William Freeman's time. They also manufacture license plates. So every New York State license plates for cars, every single one of them is manufactured today in the Auburn State Prison. Every single New York State license plate is manufactured by a man, and they are all men, who are literally walking in William Freeman's footsteps. So, yes, the Auburn State Prison still exists. I've been there, I've been inside. While I was researching it, I was very fortunate to be able to go inside. It's not easy for a researcher to get inside an American prison. American prisons are not interested in welcoming researchers. They have no reason to welcome American researchers. But I was very fortunate. I was able to get in through an educational program. Cornell University, which is an American university, has a really wonderful program where Cornell professors and graduate students work with currently incarcerated people at Auburn. And the currently incarcerated people are able to earn a degree from Cornell University, which is an Ivy League university. This is an extraordinary gift and wonderful thing. And so through the Cornell education program, I was able to get into the prison and speak with prisoners, current prisoners, while I was conducting research for this book. And then after the book was published, I was again so fortunate. I was again able to get in through the Cornell Prison Education Program. And my press, the University of Chicago Press, very generously donated 70 copies of my book, 70 copies of Freeman's Challenge, to the students who are currently incarcerated in the Auburn prison. And so these books were delivered to the prisoners and they were able to access them. And then I came and spoke to them, and it was amazing. I met with about 40 students, 40 incarcerated students, and I spoke for about half an hour. And then I talked about William Freeman and his experience in their prison. And then I asked them, what of William Freeman's experience resonates with your own and what seems different? And then we talked for about another half hour about what was similar and what was different from their own experiences. And it was very moving and very enlightening. So the main thing that they said was similar was the work. They they are not forced in the same way to work as William Freeman. In William Freeman's day, you had to work or you were just immediately tortured. That is not the case anymore, but they are coerced to work. Basically, they're not truly free to not work. And when they work, when they make license plates, for example, the maximum they can earn is 65 cents an hour, which obviously is not a living wage. And with that money, they are forced to use that money for necessities of life, things like toothpaste and underwear, things that are not luxuries, things that you must have. And so they have to have this money in order to buy things like toothpaste so they can keep their teeth in their heads. So this is not a direct form of force, but it certainly is coercion. So that was the main thing that they said was really similar. The other thing that they said was really similar was that they talked about how the prison today is a negative force for their physical health. And that was certainly true in Freeman's day. The prisoners were sick all the time. The factories had terrible air. They had a lung disease. They were not fed adequately. And that is still the case. The currently incarcerated people told me about how the food was not nutritious. The food that they were forced to eat was not nutritious, and the pollution inside the prison is terrible. So these are serious continuities from William Freeman's day until today.
Uh, I think the story of Freeman talks about how this urban system was framed as a reformist innovation. Yes, yes, it was fundamentally exploitative, as you pointed out, and as you have written in the book. There was tension between reform and profit, and that I think is going on even today, as you mentioned about the license plates and the other factories where Freeman worked and they still continue. Uh, your book traces a lineage from the urban system to the contemporary prison industrial complex that we kind of hinted at, and the mechanisms of profit driven incarceration that remain strikingly consistent in today's time. It's very, very interesting to study. And it also talks about race, criminality, the legal thought of the 19th century. We are talking about 100, 200 years ago, where things were different, where the society was different. But it also makes us question, have we really changed over the years, or we have remained the same as we were? It raises many, many important questions of memory, of resistance, of violence. I think one of the questions that occurred to me when I was reading it was the kind of uh, the system relied on rigid structure of silence, of forced labor, of isolation. But what kind of informal resistance existed within the walls of the prison? That's a question that came a lot of times when I was reading the book. How did the other prisoners kind of react to 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 the system? I'm sure it wasn't just Freeman. There might be many others who questioned throughout history. But
Yeah.
sadly, as you pointed out, there's no records of those people, or if there are records, they were maybe burned or removed or isolated
Mhm.
from the public eye, so that there won't be any other resistance kind of existing in the jail to maintain the decorum of the jail.
Mhm.
It raises significant questions, and I think the book, Freeman's Challenge, is very, very important. And we can only thank you for pointing this important history, giving voice to Freeman after so many years of obscurity. And uh, how do how do you hope this story reaches contemporary debates on incarceration and abolition, kind of, just to summarize the whole conversation? What is the legacy of Freeman's challenge?
I had a little trouble hearing you just now, but I think you asked me what is the legacy of Freeman's challenge? How can we see the effects of Freeman today? Is that what you asked me? Okay, so yeah, we can see the effects of Freeman's challenge mostly negatively. So Freeman's challenge to the Auburn prison was suppressed. And what was erected in its place was vicious racist libels, such as the criminalization of Black people. So his challenge was the suppression succeeded, and the long-term effects are devastating. Meanwhile, I'm trying to resurrect the challenge that was suppressed. I'm trying to bring back his very moral claims, his claim that no person has the right, no non-incarcerated person has the right to benefit economically from from the incarceration of another person. Why should I, as a non-incarcerated person, derive any economic benefit from any incarcerated person? it's reprehensible, the idea that I, as a non-incarcerated person, should benefit economically from another person's incarceration. That's a reprehensible idea. And what I hope people will take away from that book, from my book, is hearing that idea anew. Because at this point, the idea that prisons can be positive economic forces, that idea is everywhere. That idea is over the entire, has spread from Auburn, where where it was born. It has spread all over the entire globe. So the idea that on the one hand, prisons are bad, but on the other hand, they create jobs, that argument is morally bereft. And what I hope people will take away from Freeman's challenge, both the book and Freeman himself, what I hope people will take away is to hear that argument, prisons create jobs, and say, wait a minute, why is that a justification for prisons? There are lots of industries that create jobs. It's not like prisons are the only ways to create jobs. So why should we value prisons on the basis that they create jobs? Why should any non-incarcerated person benefit economically from the incarceration of somebody else? That is wrong. That is morally wrong. And what I hope people will take away from Freeman's challenge, from my trying to remove the suppression of Freeman's challenge, what I hope people will take away is that moral clarity.
Thank you so much, Professor Bernstein, for this brilliant book and for taking out time this morning to do this conversation. I know that you have to go for your classes at 11, but I think this is a fantastic work of scholarship because it is public facing. A lot of time, what happens with academic history for the larger audience becomes very dry and dull. But the kind of narrative that you have written in the book uh, is, if I can call it, juicy for the people who would like to get interesting facts in a very interesting format, makes it very accessible for largely non-history audience. And it is important that historians kind of reach out to the larger audience out there who might not be equipped with the historian's craft and of navigating through the difficult archives that you have managed to reimagine, if we can call it, the life of Freeman through different documents, through different challenges, through the gaps of archives. There might be gaps that you kind of faced while researching, as the biggest gap was the absence of writing, Freeman's own writings and his own thoughts. Uh, and you have navigated through it so easily for the audience. I think that's one of the, for me, it was a revealing book. It opened a new idea of history. It opened a new perspective to history, especially to the American history, which in India, not many people read. But I hope that this book, for those who are people listening to us right now, please go on Amazon or nearby bookstores if you can, get your copy. Read, because that's the only way you'll get to know a new chapter, maybe for a lot of people, a new chapter of American history. So thank you so much, Professor Bernstein. I hope that you enjoyed the conversation this morning.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and an honor to be here. I really appreciate it, and I will be delighted if folks out there will check out the book from Amazon and other places, and just thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. And as I always say to conclude the session, keep reading, keep thinking, keep questioning. That's how you keep yourself sane in these insane times. Thank you.